Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 4, Episode 33. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. The U.S. men's national team hires a coach, and a damn fine one in my humble opinion. Maurice Pochettino of Tottenham and PSG acclaim has come to the United States of America to lead us to World Cup glory. And Season 4 of The Boys, after having done a segment on the television show a couple of weeks ago, after having watched Season 4, I felt that it was required of me to make an amendment to what was a glorious recommendation of the show. I still think the show is worth watching, but there is certainly a big, bold asterisk next to that recommendation. Thank you to all of my loyal listeners. I do appreciate you. If you're new to the podcast, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review. Please send to friends and enemies far and wide. Please consider supporting. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. If you like what you hear, give me some money.
Act 1. The U.S. men's national soccer team makes a hire.
A few weeks I did a piece on how the U.S. men's national team got bounced out of the Copa America tournament in the group stage. Didn't even get into the single elimination part of the tournament. And it was basically a sad fanboy is sad piece because the U.S. men's national team, for all of the accolades that you could attribute to individual players, still wasn't performing at a high level on the international stage. Greg Berhalter, U.S. men's national coach, gets the axe, which was appropriate. If you're going to perform that poorly, the head man is always going to go down with the ship. Captain goes down with the ship. And I just felt like that was going to be the end of it. I wouldn't be doing another segment on the U.S. men's national soccer team for months, if not maybe another year, because I just assumed, as they had in years past, they were going to make another lackluster internal hire, and that would be the end of it. That we'd be in this kind of all too familiar malaise that we have with the U.S. men's national team. A lot of talent, a lot of promise, never seems to come together. Lo and behold, on The Athletic, I get a notification that the U.S. men's national team has made a hire, and it's an international hire, and it is a reputable name, Maurice Pochettino, who has recently been the manager of Tottenham, Chelsea, and PSG, Paris Saint-Germain. Last season, as manager of Chelsea, Pochettino had what you could call a mediocre, if not poor start, and that was weighing heavily on his reputation as an acclaimed or as one of the marquee international soccer coaches. Chelsea as a football club was full of kids, and he was supposed to be one of those guys that can get the most out of the kids, not only teaching them the game, but then figuring out their strengths and weaknesses and putting them in a position to succeed and succeed early. Given the way that we look at all sports these days, you really have no time to build a team and to build a culture. You've got to go in and win immediately because of the money that's at stake. Well, he's a failure. Until, of course, he wasn't. Because Chelsea in the second half of the season caught fire and played extremely well. I know this because I watched them steadily creep up on Newcastle, and I thought to myself, there's no way that this Chelsea team that looked so bad at the beginning of the Premier League season, which of course is basically longer in duration than a woman's pregnancy. I mean, this season goes on forever, so there's always an opportunity that you're going to be able to either turn something around or it's going to fall off a cliff. Well, in Chelsea's case, they turned it around, and lo and behold, they end up beating Newcastle the last match of the Premier League season and end up finishing higher in the table. And that was in large part to the fact that Maurice can take some kids and coach them up, and they end up playing pretty damn well based on their age and experience. What do we have in the U.S. men's national team? A bunch of kids with a ton of promise that haven't really looked like on the field together like they know how to win. And in my mind, they haven't been put in a position to win. They haven't had a manager that can look at what they do, coach them up, and then put them in a position, in a system to win. I saw a couple of blurbs about this being as marquee a hire as Jurgen Klinsmann back in, I think, 2005 or 2006. And the thing about Klinsmann was he was like many of the signings of that day. I'm going to point to you, dear Washington Redskins, when Dan Snyder was going out and trying to buy a football team, and all he was doing was going out and getting marquee names that really never played up to the contracts that not only they got in Washington, but perhaps had been overpriced assets in their last destination. Washington went out and paid way too much money for people that either A, were past their prime, or B, were playing in a system that did not cater to their strengths. Jurgen Klinsmann had the name of being popular as a player in Germany and having taken the German national team to a couple of World Cups where people in Germany, and as we now know, were right in their assessment, thought that he pissed away a lot of talent on that team and that the team was much better than their results. Well, the U.S., being always the little sister of the poor, the redheaded stepchild, was ready for a marquee name and went and overpaid for someone that hadn't really proven themselves on the international stage. That was a complete and total disaster. So I do not agree with the analogy that this is kind of a splashy hire in the same vein as Klinsmann, because Pochettino, he has accomplished things. He took Tottenham to a level that that club had never been to before, namely in the top five. I believe it was 2-3-2. They had a second place finish, a third place finish, and a second place finish in 3 consecutive years in the Premier League, and went to the final of the Champions League. Because there aren't going to be any more Sir Alex Fergusons in not only international soccer, but probably in any other sport. You're not going to see managers or coaches stay in one place for over a decade, if not 2 decades, if not close to 3 decades. Pochettino had worn out his welcome. He ends up going to PSG, and he had the same amount of success, I think, as many of the managers have at PSG. Didn't win the Champions League, so he was gone. Ends up going to Chelsea with a bunch of kids, where that actually looked like it was going to be a good match. And I'm not sure that if Chelsea hadn't given him a little bit more breathing room, that he wouldn't have been able to turn that into something more powerful, more of a juggernaut, because again, they started out poorly, but played very strong at the end of the season. The United States is one of the host nations in the 2025-2026 World Cup. It's going to be held here in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and it is imperative that the U.S. actually have a good showing, because as a host nation, just as it was expected in the Copa America tournament, where we were the host nation, you would expect the home team to play well. I now fully expect the home team to play well. There are some downsides with this hire, namely that Pochettino is more of a club manager and not an international coach, and that is a very important distinction. A club manager has more time to spend with his team, with his players, whereas an international coach gets these players from different clubs all around the world, basically, if it's a marquee or a top international team, and he has a little bit of time to cobble together a training schedule and an offensive and defensive philosophy with a bunch of guys that are very quickly going to go back to their club teams. Pochettino had developed a reputation for coaching up the kids, but in order to do so, you have to have time to spend with the kids. You've got to be able to watch them in training and develop training regimens for them. You've got to develop their skill set and figure out what they're good at and what they're weak at, so you can put them in positions of strength, keep them away from their weaknesses. A manager has more of an opportunity to do that. An international coach does not. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not Pochettino can translate the skill set that he's developed as a very successful club manager and take that into the international game as what you would call more of a coach. I haven't seen much about how he interacts with the media, and this is not the same as interacting with the media in a club team. Because in a club team, you're limited to the city that you're in and having to navigate the relationships with the key media players in your city. This is a national team. He's going to have to go on those stupid barnstorming tours to gin up interest and to create goodwill between all of these different elements of the club teams in the United States, all of these kind of feeder or surrogate systems that allow players to come up and to be candidates for being on the national team. He's got to cultivate the U.S. media. The responsibilities are much different. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of staff he develops and how he can navigate that gauntlet. Having said all that, I have hope. This hire has given me hope, and I have every intention of being present at some of the matches at the World Cup when the United States takes the field. Given the amount of time between now and then, the opportunity to cultivate these relationships and to create a men's national team with a purpose on both offense and defense, this may be a home run hire.
Act 2, a reflection on Season 4 of The Boys.
A couple of weeks ago, I did a piece about a television show on Amazon Prime called The Boys, and I could not have given more effusive praise of the show. I found the writing smart. I found the set production and the CGI. It all worked very well within the show. It wasn't overdone, but it was complementary to the story that the producers and the writers wanted to tell. The acting was excellent. And in hindsight, what I realized is some of the topics that were touched upon on the show, and I don't want to go into those in so much detail because I think the show is still worth watching. They were done so in a very smart, and I'm going to use this word intentionally, delicate way. There wasn't this heavy or ham-fisted attempt to make a political or a social statement based on the way the storyline developed with regard to spirituality and religion, gender dynamics in the modern workplace, sexual harassment in the modern workplace, the role of faith and hope in a modern society, in a capitalistic society, in a social media-driven society. Because I became a fan of the show, and because, of course, I had looked up things on social media about the show, as we all know, we're basically just giving away any of our thoughts, any of our dreams, any information that we have about us as human beings. We give this away to these data miners that we call social media apps. So before I know it, I'm being inundated with social media content about the boys. Now, the social media platform that I frequent the most is YouTube. So these were videos about the show, and it could be different videos about the individual actors in the show. It could be about different storylines or plot lines, but mainly it's these video breakdowns that are either covering a season of the show or covering individual episodes about the show, similar to what I did for the last season of Better Call Saul. I don't subscribe to a lot of these video review channels, so I'm getting content from video creators that I'm generally not familiar with. I'm more interested in the content that they're speaking to than I am about the source. In other words, I don't care whether or not you are a content creator that deals with sci-fi or deals with murder mysteries or whatever. If I am looking for a specific show and you're creating content about it, I'm more generally likely to click on it if I'm interested in that television program. And I was seeing, with regard to season 4 of The Boys, a number, and I'll go as far to say that it could be referred to as a slew of different videos speaking critically about the turn in season 4 and how it had gone, quote unquote, woke. And I have said it before, and I will say it again. Not a fan of that term. I feel like it's now part of the popular culture where it gets used as more of a weapon and it doesn't mean anything. It's too often used by people of the conservative persuasion to label anything they don't like as somehow bad, and it is too often defended by people of the left-leaning persuasion for things that are objectively asinine. So out of curiosity, I watched a few minutes of some of these videos, but I didn't want to get too deep into it because I had not yet begun watching season 4. When I did the segment on The Boys, I had watched 3 full seasons, the 4th season having been released this year. So in my mind, I have another full 8 episodes of enjoyable content to look forward to. But it wasn't 1 or 2 episodes in that I realized that all of the criticisms levied at season 4 of The Boys had merit. I'm not saying that all of these criticisms landed or hit the mark, but there was definitely something different about the tone of the show, specifically how heavy-handed it felt like some of the plot lines were specific to individual political and social narratives. The show, very clumsily, in my opinion, tried to develop within the universe of this superhero world this left-right divide, this kind of woke divide versus patriot divide. And at best, it was clumsy. At worst, it was something that I would expect to see on a Disney program. And in watching the show, it just made me realize that you can speak to some of these social issues that may be a concern of a producer or a writer or a director. You can speak to some of these political concerns that might be important to a producer or a writer or a director or even an actor. But you have to do so in a way that is in service of the overall storyline, and generally it can't be but so ham-fisted. It can't be so heavy-handed. It has to be subtle, and it has to work within the character story. It has to be in service of the development of the characters within whatever paradigm you're trying to create. Without getting into spoiler alerts, this was done, in my mind, pretty well, pretty cleverly, in fact, with one of the main storylines, with one of the main characters, a female who's coming into this superhero universe, who had, as a young woman, been part of a very Christian, a very dogmatic religious tradition, and then seeing the way this superhero world was managed and basically where all of the bodies were buried, right? She gets to see all the skeletons in the closet and becomes one of them in a way. How that tests her faith and how that tests her sense of trust in all of these things that we're being told. And so whether it's corporate press releases or it's the news that you're getting through the media, you see through her eyes this evolution, this fall out of grace, and then this embrace of what the fundamental tenets of that faith are. And in season 4, you have the same character, and yet it is just brazenly open and out there, this transparent attempt to shove ideology in the face of the viewer through the actions and the circumstances experienced by this character, and it just doesn't land. The setup was poor. The way the issues were worked into her storyline were very poor. And what you see on the screen is how that translates. When the actors aren't given the same caliber of material, it's difficult for them to pull it off, for them to make us as the viewer believe that they're really feeling these feelings and experiencing these emotions and quote unquote suffering. Many of the stronger storylines that were developed in seasons 1 through 3, they persist into season 4. And it's the only reason why I'm still sticking to the television program. It was renewed for a 5th and final season, as I mentioned. So I feel like I'm invested well enough to see how some of those stronger storylines play out, because that's the crux of the show. Some of these ancillary issues that they're trying to address, this left-right divide and social media influence and this cable news kind of dichotomy between left and right, it's not a part of the foundation of the show. It's just an opportunity to shove your political ideology and your social ideology into the viewer's face. And I'm not going to say that wasn't a part of the show in seasons 1 through 3, but to the extent that it was, again, it worked in service of the storylines of the television program. It was part of how the characters had to navigate the world that they were in, and it could influence the kinds of decisions that they made. And as viewers, very often we understood how these different dynamics affected the characters, whereas the characters in the show didn't understand that between themselves. And there's two different layers here. There's two different ways you could tell these types of stories. There are character arcs and there are storylines where, as the viewer, you understand many of the dynamics, whereas you're watching the characters in the show navigate those dynamics and they don't know. So you have an expectation about what's going to happen because you know something that the character in the show doesn't know. The second way to tell the story is that you, the viewer, don't know any more about what's going on or what's about to happen than the characters in the show do. And what happened in between seasons 3 and 4 of The Boys is that where in seasons 1 through 3, you had both of those type of storytelling arcs. You had situations where, as the viewer, we knew what was going on, but characters in the story did not, and so we had to see how it was going to play out. And there were other storylines where we knew no more than the actual characters in the story. In fact, characters in the story may have known more than we did, and we had to see how that was going to play out. In season 4, it's like a Star Wars show on Disney Plus. It looks like the director, it looks like the writers, and it looks like the actors don't know any more about how the story is going to play out or what the characters are going to do than you, the viewer. There's no real storyline or character development. It all works in service of some ideology that is being pushed by the producers of the show, by the director of the show, by the writer of the show. Again, you can push different ideologies, social agendas, political agendas, if it works in service of the show, if it works in service of the story or in the character's development. If it doesn't, it comes off as lazy and very transparent and often just bad television. And in different parts of each episode of season 4 of The Boys, I sat there and thought to myself, this is a roller coaster. This segment does not look like it's in the same show as the last segment. The last segment actually had me compelled and engaged, and now I'm completely outside of that, of wherever I was not 30 seconds ago, because this part of the show is so stupid. And what I'm articulating now isn't like the Game of Thrones situation that we all faced a few years ago. The last season was just an absolute disaster. It's not just bad writing. It's bad writing in service of an ideology that doesn't really fit within the universe of the show that had already been created. Season 5 of The Boys is projected to be released in 2025, and who knows what kind of world we're going to be living in by the time they actually shoot this show, edit it, and get it ready to release. But I hate to think that this show goes the way of Game of Thrones or of Lost or some of these other television programs that were so compelling for such a period of time and just ended like a wet fart. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.